Well, it's not good. And the reasons for that are as follows. I mean, one, we have this kind of long economic crisis, which we've been experiencing since the 1970s, one of which we've never really come out of fully. So if we think about long waves in the economy, we've had periods of intense investment with capital formation or wealth creation taking place, increasing productivity, and then we've had downturns that have lasted for a few decades that follow this period of expansion, and then the cycle kind of starts all over again. What we haven't seen in the past 4 decades is the kind of normal operation of this cycle in which you get a period of expansion that follows a downturn. So we've kind of been in a long, protracted downturn. And there are many reasons for this, and I don't want to get into the complexities of this too much. But what we see are many channels that are available to capital, to money, for speculative investment, which doesn't lead to capital formation or wealth creation. So we really never get the investment in the areas that we need it in order to kind of launch another wave of expansion in the global economy. So we keep finding ourselves, again, just trying to squeeze ever more speculative profits out of real estate and from other assets, creating these bubbles, and followed by their inevitable implosion or crash. Well, we've been, again, in a period of downturn for a very long time now, again, for some 4 decades. In the 1990s, it almost looked as if we might come out of one of these periods of decline, but we didn't. We just ended with another bubble, that being the stock market bubble in the United States, which then had global repercussions. So the current crisis, for instance, with Cyprus and the banking sector there, is reflective of this. You know, we see lots of capital, again, flowing around the world, but not going into the most productive areas that would lead to another phase or round of expansion in the global economy. So, for instance, what we really need are investments in alternative forms of energy, cheaper forms of energy, which in turn would lead to cheaper production, increased labor productivity, and the ability for probably people to work less, develop their human capacities more, while at the same time attracting capital for investment in those areas. But again, we're just not seeing that for a variety of reasons. And just one concluding thought on that particular topic, one of the reasons for this is because of the architecture of the global financial system. It's very fungible. It allows capital to go wherever it wants. And what we've seen in the past, especially after World War II, was a system in which states were able to check the flow and the movement of capital, and they were able to direct it oftentimes into national investment and investment in more productive areas of the economy. One can, although it's fraught with dangers to do this, I mean, one can make comparisons to one's family situation, for example. So for instance, I have a 12-year-old son, and if left to his own devices, he would probably just eat candy all day. And so I have to tell him, well, this is probably not the best idea. It might feel really good to do this at the moment, but it's not good for your health, and ultimately it will lead to you being sick. Well, we have a global economy in which investors are allowed to gorge themselves on the candy of speculative profits. But unfortunately, it leads to a kind of sickness for both themselves ultimately and the whole economy, as they're not giving the economy the nutrients that it needs from a healthier investment diet, so to speak. The Baltic States play a very interesting role within the global economy and within the attempts to overcome this kind of long crisis. So when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, in effect, some of the structures that we see now, some of the more dysfunctional structures within the global economy, were initially appearing within the Baltic states. So the British and American geographer David Harvey refers to this process of a spatial fix to a crisis of accumulation or an economic crisis. And so one of the things that we saw in the 1980s and the 1990s was just including larger areas of the world into these circuits of accumulation in an attempt to get the profits that were required to increase wealth for an investor class. And one of the areas that was targeted for expanding this global, truly global economy was the former Soviet bloc. And so the Baltics played a key role in that. The oil, which was being produced in the Soviet Union, could be acquired by people with connections at state prices, and then it could be sold at world prices, and then be brought onto the world market. So it was coming into port cities, the oil terminal at Ventspils, and from there, huge amounts of money were being made. So we saw figures such as Grigory Luchansky, one of the first billionaire oligarchs that came out of the Soviet Union, himself an academic, a vice rector at the University of Latvia, who was removed for corruption in 1982. He was selling all of the furniture at the University of Latvia, and then he found more lucrative opportunities for corruption, such as, again, acquiring state oil and selling it globally. So Latvia in particular played a very key role in bringing these commodities, oil, colored metals, and other commodities onto global markets, thus keeping their prices low, which in turn made the economy run at reasonable rates of profitability. Now, just adding to that, the other key role that Latvia played was in providing a financial architecture for this to occur. So it's one thing to get the resources out, but then you need to get the money into the pockets of people who want to pocket it, people like Luchansky and others. And so that's where we saw right from the start, right from the beginning, in a place like Latvia, the creation of these offshore correspondent banks, which were handling these massive flows of capital, coming in from the United States and West Europe, purchasing the commodities of the former Soviet bloc, and then after these commodities were purchased, the money didn't stay within Russia or the CIS, the ultimate production sources for this, but then it washed back into the banks of the United States and in London. So in effect, Russia and the CIS countries were robbed twice. Now, of course, their own people were instrumental in this theft, but nonetheless, the effect was that they were robbed. This national patrimony was taken from them in terms of these commodities. And it's an ongoing process to this very day, bigger than ever, in fact. Well, Cyprus very well may be from the perspective of historians in the future, the point where we could say that the euro died. I don't know yet, but this crisis is a very serious one. Of course, one of the features of this kind of long downturn that I described earlier of the past 4 decades has been an increase in the number of financial crises. So we had very few of these in what was known as the Bretton Woods order after World War II, in an environment in which there was heavy regulation of the financial sector, lots of national capital controls in place. Once we both deregulated finance, removed capital controls, then we started to have all of these problems with these banking crises. Now, what makes this one different, in my estimation, is a very big misstep that the European Union officials made in terms of their first response to it, and one which, of course, created much discussion here in Russia. And that was the proposal that all depositors have to bail out the bondholders, the owners of these failed banks. And so, as you know, they were suggesting that on deposits over 20,000 euros, but under 100,000 euros, 100,000 euros is the limit for the depositor's insurance, that a 6.75% penalty be paid. And then, of course, above that, a 9.9% penalty. Now, what this has done is it has very much damaged confidence in banking generally. So depositors are not going to have much faith going forward that the bank is the best place to put your money. Now, this presents a huge problem because the last time we dealt with this was during the Great Depression, and we created depositors insurance to deal with this very problem of bank runs. That's where people just go to the bank, pull all of their money out because they don't have any confidence in the banks. And so we actually solved that problem some 80 years ago, and that was a huge stabilizing force on the global economy. The European Union may have just destroyed that confidence that was built over the past 80 years, even if they do not, and it looks like they are not going to now require those depositors having under 100,000 euros to pay any kind of penalty. People now are thinking to themselves, well, maybe in the next crisis they will. And so this has been a huge blow to confidence in the banking sector and the safety of people's deposits. The big challenge that Russia seems to face is how to stop this loss of capital to places like Cyprus and to Latvia and to the Cayman Islands and to Delaware and to London, where all of these offshore structures exist. So Russia is being bled of its wealth. And this is probably the biggest threat to its economy, right from the beginning of the post-Soviet period all the way up to the present. So hopefully this crisis in Cyprus will begin a discussion, a national discussion, on what to do about this. The discussion should not be focused on whether or not one's deposits will be guaranteed by the government of Cyprus, but why is the money going there to begin with at all? And what can be done to stop this? So that money is coming from the surpluses that are generated in your economy, and that means that your workers and your middle class, especially that middle class that reproduces society, teachers, doctors, engineers, these are the people that, in effect, make the middle class and modern life possible. They're still living in a very low state in terms of their incomes. And that's because that money is being taken from the country and it's being sent abroad rather than being distributed as wages to the middle and the working classes. I think that the larger issue is that the United States wants to ensure that Russia continues to supply commodities to the rest of the world to help keep prices down for those, and that any exercise of real autonomy on the part of the Russians will upset the Americans. Meanwhile, the Russian government seems to, in a very kind of nostalgic way, want to play the role of a world power, but without really being a serious world power, without really having a plan to develop its economy moving forward, and really not doing a very good job of taking care of its own people.